So in the last video, we had a look at some of the different recording options that we have available. And as I mentioned before, I've opted to leave this out of takes to layers mode, and I'm just going to be using the standard default record mode within Studio One. I'm input monitoring my track because I'm using software monitoring over here. I'm not utilizing any of the zero latency built-in options that I have in my Studio 192. And this track is record armed as well. So the minute we press record, we're going to start. Now the next thing we need here is we need something to read. So what I've done over here is I've just pulled up the help menu in Studio One, and I figure we'll read through this paragraph over here, just so that we have some content so we can go over how to develop a voiceover signal chain. All right, so I feel pretty confident here. Let's back up to the beginning and let's see if I can roll this in one take. Now, one of the things you're going to hear me do, and this is something that I do with my voiceover techniques, and this is just because of the way I edit, is I will often leave a little small gap in between sentences. And I like to take a breath so that I can have enough air to get through the next sentence. So if I leave a little gap, that's something we're going to take care of later. Anyways, let's give this a shot. Each channel of audio in your song is represented by a channel in the console. Audio tracks in the Arrange window. Audio tracks in the Arrange view are directly represented by audio channels in the console. Whereas instrument tracks have no direct representation in the console. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. It is important to note that the console opens by default in small mode, and the following descriptions assume the mode is engaged unless otherwise noted. For more on this topic, refer to the alternative console layout section of this chapter. Okay, so that felt pretty good to me. So we've got a nice passage. You can see my dynamics are relatively clear. I've left space in between these sentences, and if I made a mistake, I restarted the sentence. So let's use a passage of this in loop mode to start setting up our record chain. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this out of record monitoring and input monitoring. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make a selection. Let's just use this over here. And I'm actually going to take snapping off because I never like to use snapping when I'm working with voiceover work. Now I'm going to do a Shift P just to loop that selection. And I'm going to use the / to activate the loop. Shift L to view the loop that I'm working with. So I'm just working on this section now. Okay, so we have this here now. Let's go ahead and play this. And then we're going to talk about creating our signal chain. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. Okay, so that's sounding pretty good. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I'm working with voiceovers in Studio One is instead of applying the plugins directly on the source track, what I will do is I will send that out to a bus. And then I will apply the plugins on a bus. So let's talk about some of the different things we can do here. Well, the first thing that I always do whenever I'm working with any type of voiceover material is I always use a subtractive EQ. Now we can use the Pro EQ here. It happens to work fantastic. And what we're going to do is we're just going to shoot for something around, let's say 85 to start. Let's see how that sounds. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output. Okay, so you can hear that extra bass that kicks in when I took the filter out. Although it sounds great and it sounds nice and full because I'm on a good set of headphones, or you might be listening to this on a good set of studio monitors, it's not necessary for what we need to do. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to search for any offensive low-mid frequencies, and then I always like to search somewhere around the 1K or the 800 where there can be really honky frequencies. Let's see if we find anything that's offensive that needs to be pulled out. Bus and effects channels. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. Okay, so maybe we can pull a little bit of 400 out, but I'm not hearing anything that's terribly offensive. Now what I'm doing here is I'm basically boosting this frequency, sweeping it around, and then when I find something that's kind of resonating, I'll just pull it down a bit. So I've opted to pull out a little bit. Like I said, it doesn't need much. Now let's see if we can find something. In my particular voice, there's usually something between 8 and 900. But that's also something that I've taken out with my RC500 on the way in as a corrective measure. But let's see if we need to pull anything else out. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types. Okay, so what I need to do now is I need to narrow this frequency over here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to adjust the Q of this frequency while it's playing. Discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. Okay, so now let's go ahead and play from here, and let's see if we can sweep this around and if we find anything we don't like. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. Okay, so there's something there. There's like a and I want to pull that out a little bit, but I don't need to pull it out too much. And one of the things you can do here, if you're really trying to fine-tune these settings, is you can use the shift modifier, and it will allow you to move in finer increments. So I can even tighten up this Q a little bit more and sweep around this frequency till I find the center of that spot. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of... Okay, now I'm going to just pull that down a little bit, somewhere around there. Okay, another thing that I like to do with my voiceovers is I like to take this and just give this kind of a gentle boost on the top end. So I might do a little bit of both. I might do like, a dB or so over here, and I might do a little bit of the shelf. But then what I do is I'll take a filter, something really steep, like a 36 dB filter, and I'll pull this down, and I'll rein this in, and I'll find that sweet spot where I'm cutting out the sizzle that I don't need, and I can have a really bright shimmering top end, but without the harshness that happens. Virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. And now because we're filtering this off, we can even push this shelf a little bit higher. So I can even do something like that. I can even be really aggressive with this and then pull it down and watch what happens. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus, and effects channel. Okay, so that's a pretty good starting point for what we're working with. Let's go ahead and bypass this and hear where we started from. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below, including input, output, bus. This is what I like to call trimming the fat, but keeping the meat and keeping the flavor. We're taking away things that we don't necessarily need, but we're leaving the main element of the voice. Now, if I did need to have this a little bit boomy, I can even employ the same technique I did over here, which is filtering the low end, but then adding a boost on the top end so that I can find that resonant peak where I want to hear that bass in my voice. But in this case, I'm just going to leave this as it is. All right, so the next thing I want to have a look at here is we're going to have a look at adding a compressor. So after we've done our EQ, what I like to call corrective EQ, and I've done a little bit of top end boost, so we've done a shaping and some corrective EQ, is let's go ahead and find the compressor. The stock compressor in Studio One is going to work perfectly fine for this. So the next thing that I want to do over here is I want to just come up with some basic settings that work for this program material and effects channels. Let's start off with a ratio of somewhere around 4 to 1, 3.5 to 1, and then I'm going to start pulling down this threshold. Instead, instrument channels represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other channel types discussed below. Okay, and I'm looking to knock off maybe just a couple dB, and that might even be too aggressive right there, including input, output, bus, and effects channels. Instead, instrument channels... And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give it a little bit of makeup gain. So somewhere around the amount that I'm compressing, I can go ahead and I can push that up somewhere around the same amount. Represent the audio output of virtual instruments. There are several other... Now for our attack and our release, we can just stick with medium for now, and that's going to work perfectly fine. But now we're just kind of taking care of some of these elements. Like you can see over here, these louder parts, they're going to kind of get shaved off, and that's going to work out great. Now in the next video, we're going to finish off our signal chain, and then we're going to take this session that we've already worked on, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to use it to create a session template so that we don't have to start from scratch every single session that we're working on.